I'm an Indian American. My family lived in the States, but we would go to India every summer to visit relatives. Up until this point, we had always stayed in Bangalore and made day trips to a village not far outside of the city to visit my uncle's family. In 2017, when I was 16, they invited us to stay with them in their village near a mountain, just for a few weeks, and make day trips to Bangalore instead. My parents figured, why the hell not? It would give us more family time, and would be less noisy and busy than the city. Now, my uncle's son, Pratap, was fairly rebellious, and had rejected his parents' attempts to arrange a marriage for him with a girl from the same village and caste for years. He didn't want an arranged marriage. He wanted a love marriage. And he held out for years, having one brief caste relationship after another with girls from Bangalore that never went anywhere and fizzled out before reaching a point where he could introduce them to his family. By this point, he was desperate, and at least partially driven by hormones to find a wife. It seemed he might soon give in to his parents' wishes and meet with a girl they thought would be a good match for him. However, after they arranged for the two to meet, he had cancelled on them and told them he had found a girl named Rapina he was serious about, and that he wanted them to meet her instead. This had all came about, my parents said, because Pratap had seen his older sister, Savrita, married off in an arranged marriage to a man that at first had seemed kind and upstanding, but had later been outed as a violent alcoholic. He killed her, and then himself one evening, after she chastised him for heavy drinking, just a few years prior. Pratap didn't want to make a mistake by marrying a chameleon. We got there while this was unfolding, after he had cancelled and before the meeting with his new girlfriend. It was late at night when we got into the village, after taking a taxi from Bangalore, which had itself followed a non-stop flight from Chicago to Bangalore. My dad and mum set up a spare room and I got the couch. It was so quiet at night out there. The houses weren't separated by much distance, but most of the folks were very conservative farmers who slept early and woke early. That first night's sleep was blissful. In the morning, I went with my dad down to the corner shop to buy a few essentials like toothbrushes and toothpaste, as well as some of his favourite treats. And on the way back, he remarked that my cousin's new girlfriend was coming over for breakfast with my cousin and would probably be there when we got back. We passed our uncle on the way back, delivering our dirty laundry, and their own, to the local washerman. He told us Pratap was home with his girlfriend, and to expect breakfast. Sure enough, when we got back, the smells of wonderful Indian home-cooked food was there, along with a woman we had never seen before. A beautiful woman, well out of my cousin's league. She was standing beneath the tree in my aunt and uncle's small yard that Pratap and his sister and I had all played on when we were young kids during my summer and day trips to their village. Pratap was there with her, and they were talking with my aunt. The first few minutes that I laid eyes on this woman are seared into my memory alongside a particular feeling. Looking back, it was her intense stare that stood out the most. When she looked at you, her eyes and the expression they wore seemed to move freely off the rest of her face. Like how you can tell a fake smile when a person doesn't smile in the eyes. Her fashion was out of place too. She was wearing boots, which was unusual for anybody over there. She had a sweet, soft voice and was friendly and extroverted, but she was always clinging to my cousin. Her arm looped around his, almost as if she was using him to balance. She seemed uncomfortable on her own 2 feet. Within minutes, the peculiar feeling was gone, and I felt pretty enamored with this bubbly, beautiful woman. I don't remember much of the first conversation over breakfast, except that it was the usual hodgepodge of questions that Indian parents ask their children's potential spouses. Where did you go to school? What do you do for a living? How much do you earn? And of course, what's your caste? My uncle and aunt or fairly liberal-minded people for village-dwelling Indians, owed partially to the fact that they had been previously in Bangalore for their education as young people before returning. They didn't mind this woman's answers to her questions, and they didn't mind her different, lower caste. I remember a lot of friendly discussion and laughter. Her laughter mostly extremely sweet and inviting. I soon forgot her strangeness, and actually felt a twinge of jealousy over my cousin's relationship with this beautiful, sweet girl. But the one thing I do remember very clearly, because I saw it for myself, and because my father remarked upon it, was that my cousin looked tired, sleepless even, and it showed a lot on his face. Bags under his eyes, faint wrinkles, and so forth. My father asked him if he had been getting enough sleep. Wink wink, nudge nudge. And my uncle hushed my father. Pratap just replied that he had been sleeping extremely well, and he must just need to freshen up a bit. When they left around noon, my uncle and aunt remarked that she seemed very sweet and a good match for my cousin, but that they think he should meet the girl they had set up for him first, before he makes a decision. My dad wasn't really interested in his nephew's love life, and made plans for us all to go find a restaurant in the village to eat, or else we would take a taxi back to Bangalore and then rickshaw around looking for a good place to get our grub. My uncle said there would be no need for that. There was a little outdoor market in the village where we could get lunch. So that's what we did. We stayed there most of the day, chatting about nothing important, and enjoying the fresh air. And when we got back to my uncle's house, the sun was setting. We had been eating all day, so none of us was hungry. So we had some tea and relaxed in front of the television, watching some ridiculous Indian movies. Near midnight, my uncle and dad retired to bed, and I turned off the TV and curled up on the couch not long after. My aunt and my mum were long asleep. It couldn't have been any later than 3 in the morning when I woke up and needed to take a piss. Their bathroom wasn't inside. Like many Indian village homes, they had an outhouse with a floor toilet, like the kind that's common across Asia. I stumbled out into the quiet dark and clumsily slammed shut and latched the door of the outhouse behind me, hoping I didn't wake anyone sleeping inside. I relieved myself and turned around to unlatch the wooden door to the outhouse and beat my retreat back inside, when I saw movement through the gap in the door. In the faint light of the moon, I caught a glimpse of the colour and texture of brown skin through the gap. I could tell the movement was very near the door. The next moment, the same moonlight illuminated an eye peering through the gap, as whoever was standing on the other side attempted to pull it open. I heard a raspy, high-pitched woman's voice say something in Indian that I couldn't quite make out. I was so startled by the gaze of a stranger and the sudden, forceful attempts to yank the door open that I yelled out loudly, "What the fuck?" I must have woken up my father because I heard the door to the house open again and he came out asking if I was alright. The eye and whoever it belonged to had vanished into the night. I unlatched the outhouse door when I heard my father's voice nearby and stumbled over the porch where he was standing. He asked me what was wrong, and I relayed to him the encounter I had just had. He cocked an eyebrow while listening and then said, "You were probably just half asleep." By this point, the adrenaline was wearing off, and I asked him about what I thought the figure on the other side of the door had said to me. I didn't speak any Kannada. I regret not learning it at home, but my parents never spoke it except in India. My dad told me it means handsome, and laughed. Even in your nightmares, the girls are eager. I didn't find this joke about it funny, and I was still shaking a bit from the encounter. We went back in, locked the door, and went back to sleep. It took me an hour to fall back to sleep, aided by the last remaining bits of jet lag. The next morning, Pratap came over for breakfast again, this time without his girlfriend. He looked even more haggard than before, like he had been under an extreme amount of stress. In his hair I caught the glimmer of a bit of grey. His parents asked him to meet with a girl they thought would be a good match for him, and after much badgering he finally relented and was convinced. My uncle asked him where his girlfriend was. He said she had gone back to her village up north from here for a few days to see her parents. My parents and his parents exchanged skeptical glances. After Pratap had left, I asked them what that had been all about. And that's when my aunt and uncle told me that there are no villages up north from here, and that Pratap must have misheard his girlfriend. I shrugged, but my parents seemed uneasy now, when before they had been fairly light-hearted. The meeting my aunt and uncle set up for the coming Saturday was 3 days off. The day before the meeting, my aunt and uncle received a frantic, shrill phone call that I later learnt was the mother of the woman Pratap was to meet. She was in a panic and crying as she asked my aunt had she seen her daughter recently. It turns out the daughter had gone for a walk to the village well earlier that day and had not returned. Her bucket was found overturned beside the well, its water spilled. In the mud near the exterior of the well were found a single pair of footprints leading away from the well. The village headman was going house to house and organising us into a search party. Pratap was at home at this time, and we all joined in the search, but nothing turned up. The disappearance of this girl cast a shadow over our trip, and we felt uneasy staying in the village, so my dad made arrangements for us to leave on Monday. This was Friday night. Pratap left early the next morning before I got up, as his girlfriend was back in the village, and the two of them took his moped to Bangalore. It was a near 5-hour trip, but he could not be dissuaded despite the recent tragedy. We watched him ride off to pick her up, and figured we wouldn't see him again until after we had made our way to Bangalore. I told my dad I was going out to the corner shop for some soda and chips. He gave me a few hundred rupees, barely interrupting his conversation with his brother, and away I went. About halfway there, I saw something that gave me a reason to pause. Rupina was walking arm in arm with a man I had never met. A very old man, quite a bit older than Pratap. She locked eyes with me, smiled, and waved, before saying something to the old man before he shambled off. I was fixed in place as she approached me, now more aware than ever of how drop-dead gorgeous she was. My heart was racing from the excitement of merely being near her. She greeted me, and I asked her what she was doing in the village, as I thought she had gone to Bangalore with Pratap. But she told me they had stopped for drinks for the road first, and that he was waiting for her. I asked her who that man was, and she told me it was her father. I didn't have any reason to doubt her, and it made sense to my horny, distracted 16-year-old brain. So I just nodded, and she patted me on the shoulder and stumbled off. But there was something else I had noticed, that I began to notice even more as she walked further away from me. Her gait was awkward and unnatural, like she had trouble taking each step. I stared after her for the longest time, when suddenly, after a bit, she turned back to look, and I felt my blood curdle at the expression on her face. Because there was no expression. It was as if her eyes were dead and the muscles in her face had been completely relaxed. Everything dripped. But I remember the face she wore when she saw that I was looking. It transformed into the most sinister, wolf-like stare I had ever seen, as the skin pulled back well beyond its normal tautness. I felt myself transfixed as she stumbled awkwardly forward, all the while staring back at me until she turned down as far straight and disappeared behind some distant houses. I didn't dare turn back until she vanished. Then I booked it back home empty-handed. When I stumbled inside, I found my parents and aunt and uncle in an excited state. My uncle was holding an axe and, to my surprise, Pratap was there. They were heatedly discussing something in Kannada for a few minutes before they noticed I was home. It was then that my parents filled me in. Pratap had not gone to Bangalore with Rupina. He left on his moped to pick her up for the trip, but had caught her in the company of another lover, a man much older than himself. They had argued, and she told him he would get over it soon enough and accept her for who she is. She told him that her love, with a dash, was true love, like what they had, and he should understand. Pratap, upon hearing this, had come running back home and left her there with the old man. Then my uncle informed me that the much older man, Adesh, was the name of a teenage boy who had gone missing from the village just 2 years before, after he went up north by himself one afternoon. That upon hearing of his decrepit elderly appearance, and bearing in mind Pratap's more and more haggard look, they had finally asked him if he had been sexually active with Rapina, which he replied, yes. Then they knew. Knew what? I was left hanging for a moment before my uncle told me that Rapina was not a living woman. The way she walked, her uncanny beauty, and the way that any man who touched her ripened like a fruit left out in the sun, gave away her true nature. She was a shirel, a vengeful spirit of a wronged woman, and they were going to kill her. Either they were very crazy or they were very right, and I was torn between both possibilities. I voiced my doubts, and my uncle glanced out the window at the tree in the yard. The same tree that Savrita, Pratap and I had climbed and laughed on together as children. He showed me the axe in his hand. "We'll find out soon enough," he said, and then out the front door he went, making a beeline for the tree, where he swung the axe back and then towards the tree. I shit you not. The moment that axe wedged itself into the trunk of that tree, a shrill wailing started up in the distance towards the mountain. This only seemed to further excite my uncle as he swung furiously at the groove in the tree again and again, until he had nearly worn through it. With each swing, the wailing drew closer, but it was still distant enough that we could not witness its source. The wailing was at its height now, and some villagers, including the headman, had gathered to watch my uncle cut down the tree. "I'm sorry, Savrita, I'm sorry. Forgive me," he kept saying in Kannada, later translated by my father to me. When the tree was felled, the wailing stopped abruptly, and my uncle, covered in sweat, collapsed at the stump and cried. His wife joined him, and they cried together. Thankfully, nothing else came up over the rest of that weekend, and on Monday we took a taxi into Bangalore. We did not see Rapina again before we left, and as far as we know, she was not seen in the village again after we had gone. We didn't make any more trips out to the village while we were there, and I haven't been back to India since. I saw my aunt and uncle one last time. They came to Bangalore with Pratap to see us off the day of our flight. Last I heard, Pratap is happily married to a woman from the same village, of the same caste, in a union arranged by his parents. Let me see if I can spin one of my uncle's yarns. I remember one he told me about funerals. Just to avoid confusion, I'm going to refer to everyone by these names: Great-Grandma, Dorothy, Uncle, Grandpa and Grandma, and Miss Clementine. When Uncle was still young, Great-Grandma Dorothy passed away. Everyone had been dreading her death, not only because they loved her, which they did, but because she had requested a traditional funeral, which was a lot of work. But in accordance with her wishes, Grandpa and Grandma held a wake in their home and invited everyone. The women all brought flowers and watched over the body in shifts for 24 hours. All of the doors and windows had to remain open the whole time, so the men watched the house during that time to keep animals from wandering in. Meanwhile, a couple of the men worked on making a simple coffin. After 24 hours, they laid Great-Grandma Dorothy's body in the coffin and said a short prayer. They then lugged the coffin out of the house. The men carried it to the family plot, where great-grandpa was buried, and laid great-grandma Dorothy to rest beside him. And that was that. Or so they thought. Not long after, though, Grandpa starts complaining that he's getting attacks of the old hag. If you don't know what that is, it's sort of like sleep paralysis. Only you physically feel like something is sitting on your chest and you can't breathe or move. This turns into a nightly occurrence. They get worse over time, until one night, Grandma wakes up with Grandpa thrashing violently in bed next to her. He's moaning and shaking, and Grandma flips on the light to find his face turning blue. She screams at the top of her lungs and starts praying. She thinks Grandpa is a goner. But then he takes a huge gasp of air and stops shaking. They both manage to calm down a bit. By this point, Uncle is wide awake, standing in their doorway. He listens as Grandpa describes the experience of the old hag. He's still shaking a bit as he talks. Says that while he's struggling to breathe, he saw an apparition watching him from the corner of the room. It was great-grandma Dorothy. Grandma instantly freaks out when she hears this. She was incredibly superstitious, and decides that they need to talk to Miss Clementine right away. I don't know what you would call Miss Clementine. Really. My uncle just always called her a wise woman. She was old as dirt, though, and lived alone in this tiny house near the woods, way off away from everyone. Uncle, being the oldest, gets sent off to ask her for advice. So now it's the dead of night. Uncle has just heard that great-grandma Dorothy's apparently back from beyond the grave, and is trudging about in the middle of nowhere, heading even further out to the sticks. Needless to say, he's thoroughly spooked by the time he finally finds Miss Clementine's. He manages to get there without pissing his pants, but damned if the old lady's not expecting him. She's standing in her doorway with her hands on her hips like Uncle is late. Then she tells him what's been going on. Apparently great-grandma Dorothy's been appearing to her for the last few nights, and the two have been doing some talking. "Your folks botched the funeral," said Miss Clementine. Uncle asks, "How?" Miss Clementine rambles in her creaky voice. "Well, they had the wake, that was good. Then they built a decent coffin, which was only right. And they buried her in the family plot, as they should have. Uncle's wishing he'd stayed in bed." She continues, "But they forgot one thing. You always carry the body out of the house feet first." Uncle is like, "What the fuck? That's stupid." But according to Miss Clementine, great-grandma Dorothy's coffin had been carried out head first, which apparently is no good for her spirit. "Head first always guarantees a haunting," she said. "But it's easy enough to fix." So she explains to Uncle what he has to do. Then he hurries back home and tells his parents what Miss Clementine told him. Fast forward a week, and the whole family is back at the house. The women, the men, my grandpa, and my uncle all go down to the great-grandma Dorothy's grave. Together, the men open the grave back up until the coffin is exposed. Then Grandma passes around a bowl of salt and everyone takes turns sprinkling a bit over the coffin. Even my dad, who was only a wee lad at the time. Then the men fill the grave in again, and everyone disperses back to their homes. After that, no more old hag, no more apparitions, and no more traditional funerals. But Uncle took a valuable lesson away from that event. This is the point where he'd lean in close and whisper the words, "Don't fuck with the dead, kiddo." I had an uncle. My dad's oldest brother. He was already old when I was a kid, and he died before I even finished middle school. I think he was kind of a fuck-up because he lived with us for a while. Dad mentioned once that he somehow lost his house. Anyway, my uncle used to help my parents put me to bed by reading me scary stories out of this huge book. He claimed it was his journal, and that the stories were all true. I still remember a few, and I may as well share them because I love these threads and I wanted to keep it. Just imagine you're 9 years old, like I was, and you're shitting your pants as your uncle reads these. Uncle worked up north for a few years on a ranch. Seasonal work, spring through summer usually. Sometimes years he'd work for less, sometimes more. But he was always gone by fall. Every spring he'd return and find that the rancher's house had a lot of damage. The two of them would fix it up, and then my uncle would stick around and help them around the ranch. One spring he came back and the rancher had a broken leg. Rancher said he fell off the roof fixing it. He notices the house looks especially bad this year. It had a huge wraparound front porch, but it's been practically demolished. Rancher says a tree fell on it, but there's no trees near the house. The rancher is out of commission due to the broken leg, so Uncle has to repair the porch himself. Time passes and the rancher heals. One morning, Uncle is helping around the ranch while the rancher goes off hunting. Everything's fine until Uncle spots the rancher heading out of the woods. He's walking backwards, with his shotgun raised, aimed at the trees. Uncle immediately thinks, oh fuck, that must be a mountain lion. He runs to the back of his truck where his gun is, grabs the gun and rushes towards the rancher. As he's rushing over, he notes something bizarre. The grass is tall in that area, and it seems to be bending like there's a wild breeze. But only there isn't one. Realizes that the grass is bending from the tree line towards the rancher, like something is walking through it, only nobody's there. For some reason, this spooks my uncle so much that he yells out like a fucking barbarian. This startles the rancher and he fires off a round. Immediately, the grass stands back up like whatever was moving through it is gone. The rancher then runs back towards the house and tells my uncle to come inside. Uncle asks him what the hell was that, and the rancher was shaking like a leaf, saying, "It was a mountain lion, it was a mountain lion." My uncle's thinking bullshit. That it would have to be an invisible mountain lion. But there wasn't an animal in sight. But the rancher looks mega spooked. So he drops it, and the two calm their nerves over some whiskey. Uncle passes the summer on the ranch. He's waiting for the rancher to offer some explanation about what he saw, but he never does. Before Uncle leaves that summer, rancher gives him a bonus and tells him he's earned it. Fall and winter pass. Next spring, Uncle returns to the ranch. He shows up and there's a crew doing repairs in the house. My uncle's confused about this. He knocks on the door and some young guy answers. Even more confused, Uncle explains that he worked there every spring and summer and mentions the rancher's name. The nephew tells him that he's the rancher's nephew, and that the old man passed away, unfortunately. My uncle's obviously saddened by this and asks what happened. Nephew shakes his head. We don't know, but it looked like a mountain lion might have got to him. My uncle's blood runs cold. He recalls the weird event from the previous summer. And the house? He asks. The nephew shakes his head again. We don't know. Here's another story from my uncle's journal. In this story, my uncle is a teenager back home in Alabama. Rural town, very racist. But the polite sort of racists from back in the day. Anyway, there's a woman whose family is a little nuts. Let's call her Elizabeth. Elizabeth has been a little nuts herself, but the family's got money, so everyone treats her with respect. One day, her parents die on a trip out west. The family home passes to her sisters and to her. Elizabeth's sisters also die. No sign of illness or anything. They just keel over one day. Everyone suspects the crazy bitch poisoned her sisters. But since they can't prove anything, they have to let the matters drop. But in a small town, rumours spread. Gossip turns into folklore. Elizabeth is a witch. She killed her parents using black magic, and then she used it on her sisters too. Local kids tend to keep away from her house. They say she has a body of a lover tied up in her bed, and she sleeps with it at night. You see, before she went crazy, Elizabeth had a fiancé. He was just a local boy who came from nothing, but he had a knack for business and started up a factory of some sort. Money coming out of his sleeves, rags to riches type of story. But then Elizabeth's mind started to go, like a lot of other women in her family. Then the fiancé suddenly disappeared. Everyone had assumed he just couldn't stand to marry a lunatic, and hightailed it out of town. But after the parents died, the fiancé came back. He and Elizabeth were seen riding around together through town. There was talk of them getting married. This pissed most of the women off. They assumed the fiancé was taking advantage of the poor little crazy girl for her inheritance. But one day, the fiancé disappeared. For a while, people assumed he just decided against marrying Elizabeth after all. But like I said, the rumours turned vicious, and a story cropped up about Elizabeth killing her fiancé. They said she tied his corpse up to her bed and slept with it. Others said she put a spell on him to keep him alive, but essentially brains. And the two lovers would canoodle and kiss at night. Of course, Uncle was too smart for those old bedtime stories, and he used to make fun of his friends for believing in them. So they dared my uncle to go and sneak into Elizabeth's house. The night he went, it happened to storm earlier in the day, which sometimes caused the cemetery to sink for some reason. So here comes Uncle, dead of the night, sneaking into Elizabeth's house in the pouring rain, with the smell of death and decay all around him. He managed to sneak in through the basement window. When he skulked through the house, sopping wet and dripping water over the place, the smell of death was even stronger inside the house, which seemed odd. Soon my uncle came up to a huge staircase leading upstairs. Of course, his friends all wanted him to see if the fiancé's body was really in her bedroom. That meant Uncle would have to climb the stairs to the top floor and sneak down the hall to the crazy bitch's bedroom. He realised he was a little nervous, mainly because he didn't know if Elizabeth was one of them violent crazies, but he wouldn't go back on a dare. So he tiptoed up the stairs and down the hall and towards the room, and he realised as he was approaching it that the smell of death and decay was getting worse. Then he heard a creak behind him and felt a heavy hand grip his shoulder, much too heavy and much too large to be Elizabeth's. Uncle froze. A deep voice behind him said, "What you doing, young man?" Uncle turned around and it was an old man, a black guy dressed like a butler. Uncle had not even considered that Elizabeth had someone in the house helping her out. He jumped to escape the old black man's grip, but the man's hand clamped down hard. Uncle struggled and kicked the shit out of the guy and ran down the stairs. The old man tried to chase him down the stairs, but, he's an old man. So my uncle escapes and runs all the way home in the pouring rain and the smell of death. He never manages to see whether there was a body in Elizabeth's room or not, but he told all of his friends about how he'd smelt the stench of decay coming from behind the door. They were all thoroughly impressed. Elizabeth died several years later. By then, Uncle had moved away from Alabama. He'd just started helping out in that ranch I mentioned earlier, and one fall he comes back home to visit his folks and catch up with some old friends. Over some beers, he happened to mention the time he snuck into Elizabeth's house. His friends get real quiet. "What's wrong?" he asked. His friends explained to him, in hushed voices, that after Elizabeth died, the old man had phoned her relatives in Louisiana. They came back and took care of her funeral arrangements. Then Elizabeth was quickly buried and the house demolished. The following Sunday, the minister, the only person outside of the family who had been allowed to enter Elizabeth's room, gave a strange sermon. From the sound of it, it seemed to confirm all the strange rumours about Elizabeth. But nobody to this day is sure, and the minister refused to ever talk about it again. Hi guys. Thank you for staying to the end and listening, and I really hope you enjoyed it. And thank you so much for coming back every week. I know I have been known to be not so reliable with my uploads, but I'm trying. I'm really trying, guys. But yeah, thank you, and hit subscribe and hit the notification bell. And leave a comment. It really helps out in the algorithm. And I'll see you next week. Bye.